I'm Mark from eReplacementParts.com. In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the upper motor bearing on a Porter cable random orbital sander. The upper motor bearing attaches to the motor's armature and allows it to rotate. Like any bearing, it will wear and eventually it'll fail. The first signs of a bad bearing will be a squeal sound coming from the sander. It's important to replace the upper motor bearing at the first signs that it's going bad. If you continue to use it, eventually the bearing will lock up. When it does, the outer race will begin to rotate within the plastic housings, and it'll melt those housings, and then you'll have a much bigger problem to take care of. Replacing the upper motor bearing is easy to do, and I'm going to show you how. Upper motor bearings, as well as many other parts, can be found on our website. Let's get started. I'll begin by removing the 3 screws that secure the sander pad to the sander. Now I can remove the clutch belt. Next I'll remove the black sander pad housing. It's held in place with 2 screws. With the screws removed, I can separate the 2 halves of the housing. Now I'll remove the dust pad housing O-ring. I'll use a screwdriver to get it started, and then I'll just pry it away from the housing. Now I'll remove the sander pad support. I removed the sander pad housing so I'd be able to grab the fan so that the screw doesn't just rotate as I try to remove it. With the pad support removed, now I can go ahead and remove the fan. The 2 halves of the motor housing are secured with 4 screws. I'll go ahead and remove those now. With the screws removed, now I can split 1 half of the housing. Now I'll pull the brush holders away from the armature. With the brush holders out of the way, now I can go ahead and remove the armature. With the armature removed from the sander, now I can go ahead and remove the upper motor bearing. Normally I'd like to use a bearing puller to do this, but the manufacturer hasn't given us a dimple on the end of the armature shaft to use the bearing puller. So instead I'll use a bearing separator and a vise. I'll place the separator over the bearing, go ahead and tighten it up. I have the vise jaws open just wide enough for the armature to pass through. And now you can use a punch and a hammer to remove the armature. Now I can install the new upper motor bearing. I'll press it onto the shaft by hand, and then I'll place the bearing on a hard surface, such as the end of my vise. Now I'll use a hammer to tap the armature shaft until it seats the bearing. However, I don't want to actually strike the shaft itself because I'll damage these threads where the pad support screw attaches. So what I'll do is screw the pad support screw back into the shaft, and then I'll actually strike the screw. Now we can install the armature back into the sander. There's an O-ring that fits over the upper motor bearing and provides some cushion between the armature and the housing. Now I'll slide the armature through the field and make sure that that O-ring aligns with the gap in the housing. Now we can install the brush back into the sander and I'll do this again on the other side. Now we can reinstall the housing. You might notice this little rubber bumper. And this just goes down in the housing where the bearing attaches. And again, that's there just to provide a little cushion to the bearing so the bearing has a little room to play. I'll make one last check of the wires and make sure everything's tucked out of the way so they're not going to get pinched. And then reattach the housing. And it gets secured with the screws. Now I'll slide the fan back over the shaft. Now I'll place the pad support back over the fan and spindle. Next comes the washer. The side with the recess should be facing towards you. And I'll secure it all with the screw. And again, I'll hold the fan to prevent the motor shaft from spinning as I tighten down the screw. Now I can install the pad housing O-ring. Now install the pad housings. They just slide over the gray motor housing, and I align the ends with the seam in the motor housing. Both sides, and then I'll secure it with the screws. Now I can install the clutch belt. First I'll wrap it around the fixed pulley and then around the pad support. And I'll rotate the pad support until the belt's in place. Now I can install the pad. A trick to make it a little easier to align it is to insert a small screwdriver through one of the holes in the pad. Then I put that same screwdriver in the hole in the pad support, and then I secure it with the screws. And that's all it takes to replace the upper motor bearing on a Porter Cable random orbital sander. If you found this video helpful, be sure to give us a thumbs up and leave a comment.